Welcome, lovers of scary and interesting stories. Today, I have one for you. I'll tell you more. I personally haven't heard anything like this before, and honestly, I hope I never hear it again. Anyway, the story is really interesting. The case is unusual. There's no other way to put it. So enjoy listening and let's get started.
On the night of January 11th, 1993, Dr. Leoc Admiral, who lived in a quiet French town near Geneva, received a call that forever divided his life into before and after. His best friend's house was on fire. When he arrived at the scene, the firefighters were already carrying out the charred bodies of his friend's two children, 5-year-old Antoine and 7-year-old Caroline, as well as their mother, Mrs. Florence. Only Jean-Claude Roman, the father of the family, was still breathing. The unconscious man, nearly fainted, was taken to the burn unit. 20 years of friendship, shared student years, getting married almost at the same time, children who grew up together. Leoc was even Jean-Claude's daughter's godfather. Their lives seemed like mirror images of each other. And now the life of his best friend is completely destroyed. At first glance, it seemed like an accident. The boiler exploded, or there was some kind of electrical malfunction. But at the same time, some inexplicable gut feeling told Leoc that something was wrong here. By morning, Leoc and his wife prayed for just one thing: that their best friend Jean-Claude Roman would never wake up again. What could the best friend have known that others didn't know yet? Thank you. Well, my dears, the answer to this question will turn out to be more terrifying than anyone can imagine. But of course, all in good time. Jean-Claude Roman was born on February 11th, 1954 in the town of Lons-le-Saunier. But later the family moved to a nearby village, Clans. The family was closely connected with forestry. His father, Ima Roman, managed a sawmill and was truly a respected person in the village. He embodied those traditional French values. That means hard work, restraint, and respectability. His wife, Anne-Marie, did not work. The woman took care of the household and also raised their son. She was deeply religious, and the family's reputation meant everything to her. Here's another interesting point. In the Romanov family, emotional displays like tears, fear, or anxiety were considered a weakness. That was unacceptable. The old familiar philosophy prevailed like, but what will people say? When his mother was upset, little Jean-Claude wasn't allowed to show his own feelings and had to keep a straight face. In such an atmosphere, the boy quickly learned to hide all his true feelings, as well as minor faults, so as never to upset his mother or break the family's illusion of perfection. Much later, psychiatrists would call this a false self, a kind of mask that Jean-Claude would wear all his life. But overall, he was an exemplary child. At school, people spoke only positively about him. A quiet, obedient, diligent student. His parents hoped that he would continue the family business, follow in his father's footsteps, and also work in the sawmill industry. But Jean-Claude had slightly different plans. In 1971, of course, in the last century, he enrolled in preparatory courses at the prestigious Lycée du Parc in Lyon. This is one of the best educational institutions in France, which prepared students for admission to the elite Grandes Écoles. It was truly a huge leap for an ordinary country boy. Lyon is the third largest city in France, a cultural and intellectual center of the country. And Lycée du Parc is a kind of world where the children of professors, doctors, lawyers, and generally representatives of the bourgeoisie studied. So Jean-Claude found himself in a completely foreign, new environment. His classmates talked about things he didn't quite understand. They lived in a world very far from his rural life. And they constantly pointed out the provincial accent, the insecurity, the boy's difference. In short, young Jean-Claude was bullied for being a villager. But there is no 100% confirmation of this, but the fact remains. After the first semester, Jean-Claude left his studies. That was when the first major turning point in his life occurred. You see, instead of going back home and admitting his failure to his parents, he decided not to say anything. That is, he continued to receive money for his studies and travel to Lyon, but in reality, he no longer showed up at the lycée. It seemed like it was just a small, innocent lie. But it was this lie that would later set in motion a chain of events that, 22 years later, would lead to tragedy. Later, Jean-Claude decided, let's say, to raise his social status. At that time, the people who were most respected and honored in society were especially important to him. In his opinion, it was doctors, and that's not far from the truth. In 1970s French society, being a doctor meant not just a job, but prestige, respect, and power. These were people who were entrusted with the most intimate secrets, and who had the right to make decisions about someone's life or death. At least that's how Jean-Claude interpreted it, so he told his parents that he wanted to become a doctor. And they were thrilled. Their son, a simple village boy, was finding success in an elite profession through his own efforts. It would seem that this was his own choice, but in reality, it's not that simple. Later, it would turn out that even touching a human body caused the man disgust. Medicine was hardly his calling, but it was definitely a way to achieve the status he so desired. In 1975, Jean-Claude actually enrolled in Lyon's medical faculty, and the first 2 years, well, everything was fine. He wasn't a brilliant student, but he was definitely diligent. And it was during his medical studies that he met Florence Croteau. She was a modest, sweet girl, who was also a distant relative of Jean-Claude, a cousin. Besides, she came from the same provincial background as the hero of this video. Madame Florence hesitantly agreed to a relationship with Jean-Claude. Later, among friends, he met Luc Moroz, the admiral, who would later become his closest friend. This is the very person I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So Luc was a real doctor, a successful student, and it was with him that Jean-Claude would spend the happiest years of his life. And yes, it would be Luc who would later be the first to learn about the true nature of the tragedy. And then something pivotal happens. You see, in 1982, during his second year of medical school, Jean-Claude doesn't show up for the crucial exam. That exam is truly not an ordinary one, but a key moment in the education of a French medical student. Failing it means either repeating the year from the beginning or leaving medicine altogether. The reasons for the young man's presence at the exam remain unclear. Some say that Jean-Claude missed it because of a hand injury. Others say he was in a deep depression because of either a quarrel or a breakup with Florence. I don't know, maybe he just wasn't ready at the time, or maybe he already felt it back then. That in reality, he would never be able to become a real doctor. The outcome was expected anyway, Jean-Claude was expelled. But again, he assured his family and everyone around him that he had successfully moved on and was now studying in his third year. This became a quiet, shadowy part of his biography. The lie, which started as a small, innocent cover-up, began to gain momentum, and over the years would turn into the tragedy of his entire life. Well, yes, not only his, but we'll talk about that later. So, Jean-Claude spent the first semester of his imaginary third year in depression. He locked himself in the apartment his parents had given him and just lay there. He didn't leave it, hardly ate and hardly slept. At least not properly. Weeks passed before Luc, his friend, was able to reach him by phone. He assumed that his friend's absence was connected to a quarrel with Florence. And he tried to have an honest conversation with Jean-Claude, but instead of admitting the truth, he chose yet another lie. A much bigger one. You see, he told Luc that he had Hodgkin's lymphoma, in other words, cancer. Moreover, he even managed to get a certificate somewhere that confirmed his diagnosis. He later explained his absence to his friends. And then, surprisingly, after a heroic battle with cancer, he suddenly recovered and resumed his studies. However, he returned to the second year again. It was then that Jean-Claude revealed a real talent for deception. Taking advantage of the bureaucracy of French universities, he registered as a second-year student for 12 years in a row. That is, he always had a valid student identification. This scheme lasted until 1986, when the new dean's office asked the phantom student to visit them in person and explain what was going on. By the way, at that time, student status exempted a man from paying income taxes. It also gave him the opportunity to use the library and, in general, all the privileges of the university. Basically, Jean-Claude could do everything his classmates did to become doctors, except for one thing. He couldn't become the same type of doctor. Here, it's worth going back a bit to the story of Jean-Claude's phantom cancer. There's no other way to call it. Of course, he also spun a tale for Florence and the others, and quite convincingly. He insisted that he was really sick, very seriously. And taking advantage of the woman's sympathy and trust, he made an offer she couldn't refuse. But not out of fear, like in The Godfather, but because she truly felt sorry for Jean-Claude. On February 7th, 1980, they got married. Officially, the wedding was modest, provincial, but seemingly happy. At least, the parents of both families were truly happy. Their children were starting a new respectable family. Florence failed the exam again. But, unlike Jean-Claude, she didn't try to hide it and started studying pharmacology. Later, she really became a good pharmacist. Meanwhile, Mr. Jean-Claude was creating his own parallel world. It's hard to imagine how much energy and effort he put into pretending to be a doctor. He even went to Paris to take competitive exams for a position at prestigious scientific institutions. Of course, he didn't take any exams, but he told everyone that he had gotten a prestigious position. A researcher at the World Health Organization, that is, World Health Organization in Geneva. Later, together with Florence, he settled in Prevessin-Moëns, a small French town near the Swiss border, just a few minutes' drive from the World Health Organization headquarters. In other words, it was the perfect place for his imaginary job. In 1985, the couple had a daughter, Caroline, and in 1987 a son, Antoine. On the outside, they seemed like the perfect family. Seriously, just imagine a successful World Health Organization researcher, pharmacist wife, 2 great kids, and a quiet suburban home. The family's neighbors were truly jealous of them, but Jean-Claude never invited his colleagues home. Besides, he did everything to make sure he wasn't bothered at his supposed job. His wife didn't have the phone number of his office, and the only way to contact him was through an answering machine, which he checked himself. Every morning, he took the kids to school and then drove to the World Health Organization parking lot, and he just sat in the parking lot, in his car. For hours. He would sometimes read medical journals to keep up conversations with his doctor friends. Sometimes he would go into the World Health Organization building to use the bank or the travel agency. They were located on the lower floors. But he never went up to the upper floors. That's where the real researchers worked. On Thursdays, Jean-Claude supposedly gave lectures at the Dijon University. In reality, he just went there and spent a day in the library, or again walking alone, or sitting in his car. But that's not all. He also pretended to go abroad, supposedly for conferences or consultations. In reality, he would just stay at an airport hotel and then come back home, complaining about time zone changes, jet lag, and all that. By the way, from these trips he never forgot to bring gifts for the kids from the countries he supposedly visited. Later, psychiatrists would call this a psychotic personality organization. This is the ability to create and maintain an alternative reality, one that Jean-Claude truly, completely, and wholeheartedly believed in himself. You can probably see the obvious question, where did this gentleman get his money? He initially lived off money from selling their apartment, which her parents had given her. His wife, Florence, was always a pharmacist, but it was still their income. The salary wasn't enough for the lifestyle that the husband was showing. That's when he basically started building a kind of financial pyramid, but a very specific one. Jean-Claude assured his relatives and friends that he had access to private Swiss bank accounts through his connections at the World Health Organization, and he offered to invest their money at interest, high interest. His parents, father-in-law, and even his friend Leoc all trusted and relied on him without hesitation. A significant part of their savings. The money, of course, just disappeared into the black hole of Jean-Claude's invented life. Gifts, restaurants, gas for endless trips to nowhere, rent payments. When someone asked about the interest, the man would show forged bank statements. Everything is going well and growing. Aside from financial scams, Jean-Claude also has a mistress. Once Luc introduced him to his acquaintance, Mrs. Chantal Deladon, Jean-Claude quickly became obsessed with having an affair with the woman. The woman herself lived in Paris, which was the perfect place for secret meetings. Jean-Claude could easily go unnoticed by family and acquaintances. At first, Madame Chantal didn't interest him. Eventually, she accepted his attention and gifts. He even convinced his lover to invest her own money in those same non-existent funds. In 1988, an event occurred, which, let's say, might have been a rehearsal for the future tragedy. That's not certain, but later you'll draw your own conclusions. I'll be glad to read them in the comments. So, Jean-Claude's father-in-law, Mr. Pierre Croteau, who also provided him with a significant amount of investment funds, one fine day decided to withdraw part of his capital to buy a Mercedes. He called Jean-Claude and asked him to arrange the funds transfer. On January 9, 1988, that is 5 years before the tragedy, Pierre Croteau suddenly dies, apparently by accidentally falling down the stairs at home. Under strange circumstances, there was no one in the house except Jean-Claude, who became the only witness. The rescuers who arrived at the scene later claimed that they heard Mr. Croteau mumbling something unclear, something like Jean-Claude, Jean-Claude. But then Jean-Claude immediately intervened and put an oxygen mask on his face, muffling his last words. Pierre died from his injuries a few days later, never regaining consciousness. The court ruled it an accident. Later, Jean-Claude organized his father-in-law's funeral and began a fundraiser among family and friends. Of course, he kept all the donations for himself. Was it really an accident, or was it actually the first murder? We will probably never know this. If you think you've already figured it all out, dear ones, believe me, you haven't. By the early 1990s, Jean-Claude Roman was successfully managing his fabricated life. For more than a decade, he had become a true master of lies, simultaneously juggling dozens of stories, forged documents, and imaginary meetings. But eventually, it all started to fall apart. The affair with Miss Chantal's lover was brief. The woman initiated the breakup, and then Jean-Claude told her he had stage 4 cancer, seemingly hoping she'd stay out of pity. Haven't we heard this before? Miss Chantal really reacted quite strongly to this, but not in the way Jean-Claude expected. You see, afraid that he would die and she would lose her money, the woman asked him to return all her investments. When the man refused, she pressured him and even threatened to call the police. At the same time, the man's relatives and acquaintances started calling him more and more often because of suspicious bank transactions, as well as the promised interest that never arrived. In December 1992, the president of the school board, where the children of Roman Jean-Baptiste Féchot studied, decided to organize a charity event in support of a World Health Organization research project. So he asked Jean-Claude for his colleague's contact information. Jean-Claude tried to refuse, but Féchot insisted. It was necessary. He even called the World Health Organization himself, but of course, he couldn't find any trace of Dr. Roman. Makes sense, since he was never there. On January 5th, 1993, Féchot informed Jean-Claude's wife, Mrs. Florence, that he couldn't find her husband's name in the World Health Organization directory. The confused woman asked her husband directly what was going on. He said it was just an administrative error, since he works in a secret department. Of course, his last name isn't listed in public directories for security reasons. But by that time, Ms. Florence had already started to have doubts. Perhaps for the first time in 13 years of marriage, she wondered, did she really know her husband? Jean-Claude sensed his double life was unraveling. The mistress wanted money, relatives questioned investments, his wife grew suspicious, and then there was the school board president. So, on January 9, 1993, he withdrew 2,000 francs and went to visit his father in Clans. He borrowed a .22 caliber rifle from him, saying he was going hunting. On his way home, Jean-Claude bought a silencer for the rifle and 2 cans of gasoline. When he came home that evening, his children were doing their homework. His wife, Florence, was making dinner. It was an ordinary, quiet, peaceful family evening. Later, after the children were asleep, Jean-Claude and Florence talked. She might have asked about World Health Organization again or mentioned the strange FSHO call. It's unclear. According to the investigation, the man killed his wife after brutally beating her, most likely with the butt of a rifle. He left the body in bed and covered it with a blanket, as if she were just sleeping. Then he went to sleep himself. Nearby, the next morning, January 10th, unlike his wife whom he had killed, he woke up as usual. He woke the children up, made breakfast. Then they sat together in front of the television and watched cartoons. The children laughed and ate treats. A wonderful Saturday morning. After breakfast, Jean-Claude told the children to return to their beds for a nap. Caroline and Antoine obediently went to their rooms without question. First, their father entered his daughter's room. The 7-year-old girl lay peacefully in bed. Maybe she smiled at her father, maybe she asked where her mother was. It's unknown. But it is known for sure that Jean-Claude shot her in the head from just a few centimeters away and then carefully covered her with a blanket. Then he went to the room of his 5-year-old son and shot him in the back. But that was not the end. Jean-Claude knew some people could still expose him. His lover, Chantal, suspected financial fraud, and his own parents, could ask too many uncomfortable questions. Around noon that day, after leaving his wife and children's bodies at home, Jean-Claude drove to the village. His parents were in Clon. The first thing they did was sit down for lunch. His mother asked about the grandchildren, and his father was interested in his work. After lunch, Jean-Claude asked his father Aimé to go up to the attic, as if to show him something, some old things, memories. In the attic, in the narrow space among the old furniture, Jean-Claude shot his father in the back of the head. 75-year-old Aimé instantly fell to the floor. Dead, Jean-Claude went downstairs. At that moment, his mother Anne-Marie was in the kitchen, possibly washing dishes or making tea. In any case, the woman didn't hear the shot, so she was calm, and her son just as calmly shot her in the back. The 73-year-old woman fell dead by the sink. But even the family Labrador dog named Sam didn't survive that day. Jean-Claude shot him too. What a scumbag, and I'm not talking about the dog. Before leaving the house, the killer tried to cover up the traces of the crime. He wiped some surfaces, took the shell casings, but he didn't set the house on fire. Maybe he didn't want to attract the neighbors' attention yet, I don't know. The main thing is, as you understand, he still left traces of his work. After leaving his parents' home, Jean-Claude went to Paris. His target was Chantal Deladante, a lover who demanded her money back. On January 10, late in the evening, he met with her. He invited her to a fake dinner in Forêt de Fontainebleau, supposedly with Bernard Kouchner, a famous doctor and politician, whom he, of course, didn't actually know. Chantal agreed, and they got into the car and went together to this fictitious meeting. They were driving along the dark roads of the Fontainebleau forest, and at some point Jean-Claude said, "We're lost." Then he stopped his car in a deserted place. Then he asked Chantal to get out of the car, supposedly so they could look at the map together and figure out where to go next. When she got out, Jean-Claude took a rope, put it around her neck, and started strangling her. At the same time, he also used a pepper spray, spraying it right in her face. But you see, again, Miss Chantal was tough. She resisted, she fought back, just like last time. And she actually managed to break free. Jean-Claude was shocked and then changed his approach. He apologized, cried, and blamed everything on side effects. After all, he's taking cancer medication stage 4, remember? He begged her to forgive him. Chantal was scared, disoriented. She didn't know what to do. At the same time, Jean-Claude kept crying and made her promise that she wouldn't tell anyone about this incident. He also threatened that if she did tell, he would end his own life. So she never gets her money back. Jean-Claude took his former lover back to Paris. In the end, she got out of the car traumatized but alive. Overall, she was the only victim of the man to survive. On the morning of January 11, not a doctor, not a human being, returned to his house where the bodies of those he had killed, his children and wife, still lay. An eerie, absolute silence filled the place, but Jean-Claude knew what to do. He methodically poured gasoline over all the rooms, and in fact over everything. The furniture, the walls, the bodies. He carefully prepared everything for the final destruction of the evidence. And then he took a huge dose of sleeping pills. Really enough to fall asleep and never wake up, supposedly. Around 3 or 4 a.m., he set the house on fire. Was he trying to end his life? Probably not, since the pills the man took were expired. Besides, as someone who had studied medical literature for 18 years, he had access to much more effective means. At the very least, he knew about them. Later, psychiatrists would say that Jean-Claude subconsciously wanted to be saved, or that his lies finally came to an end. So the fire started around 4 in the morning. The fire quickly engulfed the wooden house, which was soaked in gasoline. Passers-by began appearing on the street, along with utility workers clearing the roads after the night's snowfall. They couldn't help but notice the hellish fire show, and they immediately called the firefighters. They arrived quickly and rescued Jean-Claude, who was semi-conscious in the hallway with minor burns. But, as already known, the man's wife and children had been dead for a long time. At that time, everyone thought it was a tragic but undoubtedly accidental event. The family died in the fire, and the father miraculously survived. Local Admiral, arriving at work that morning, met the police officers. They told him the terrible news. His best friend lost his family in the fire. The man immediately went to the hospital to be with his friend during this terrible time. But just a few hours later, the police came back with new details. Mr. Roman's wife and children didn't burn in the fire. They were shot. This was definitely not an accident, but a planned murder. A little later, the bodies of Jean-Claude's parents were also found. They had also been shot. Then the police began to question Liuk in detail about his best friend's life. Where did he work? What did he do? What were his habits like? That's when Liuk, who'd known Jean-Claude for 20 years, his closest friend and his daughter's godfather, realized a terrible problem. In fact, he didn't know anything about his friend. At all. He didn't know the phone number of the World Health Organization office. Jean-Claude had asked not to be disturbed at work. The names of his colleagues? He didn't know that either. Jean-Claude never mentioned them. He only roughly knew the office address and had never been there. When the police themselves called the World Health Organization, it quickly became clear there had never been any Jean-Claude Roman there. He'd never even been there, much less worked there. 18 years of lies and a fabricated life that everyone believed in. Even Luke, the killer's best friend, noticed nothing. During questioning, Jean-Claude Roman at first refused to talk to the police. He just lay in the hospital, silent, completely detached from everything. But eventually, he gradually started to talk. Not right away, but he did, in parts, in fragments. The psychiatrist who worked with him described a rather strange picture. Jean-Claude talked about the murders as if he were describing something that happened to someone else, without emotion, without remorse, like a kind of report on an experiment. When asked why he did it, the man replied like this: "It's better for my family to die than to find out the truth." For Jean-Claude Roman, reputation, image, and success mattered more than life itself. That included not just his life, but also his wife's and children's. The psychiatrist François Bionde, who conducted the evaluation, explained that Jean-Claude developed a paranoid personality organization. He lived in his own imaginary world, where lying was normal and he couldn't tell truth from lies. So it became part of an entire system, small, innocent in childhood, just not to upset his mother. Later it became decades of deception. When the walls of the artificial world began to close in and the risk of exposure became real, Jean-Claude couldn't take it anymore. He was afraid that his whole world would collapse if he was exposed, so he decided to take radical action. By then it was easier for him to kill everyone who knew him than to admit the lie. The trial started on June 25, 1996. France was stunned. Jean-Claude's case became one of the most high-profile criminal events of the entire decade. Journalists called the man l'adversaire. I hope, again, that the stress is correct, because I don't speak French at all. I'm a little better in Ukrainian, but my stresses are like this. This word has multiple meanings in French. An enemy, a rival, but also someone who opposes themselves. The writer Emmanuel Carrère wrote an entire book about this case with the same title, L'Adversaire. It became a real bestseller and was later translated into 26 languages. At the trial itself, Jean-Claude remained completely calm. It seemed like he didn't care at all about what was happening. He answered questions in a monotone, emotionless, and methodical manner. The lawyers tried to find mitigating circumstances, such as depression, mental disorder, unbearable pressure, but the facts screamed for themselves. 5 murders committed over 2 days. It wasn't an outburst of emotion, but a cold-blooded elimination of everyone who could expose the lie. On July 6, 1996, Jean-Claude Roman was found guilty of 5 murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the next 22 years. The man listened to his sentence without emotion. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, he just nodded in agreement and left. Behind bars, Jean-Claude became a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, hardworking. He didn't waste any time at all. In 2004, years after his conviction, he even received a diploma. However, it wasn't in medicine, but in computer science. It was distance learning, but the diploma was real this time. He also had long-term therapy and was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, inability to feel genuine empathy, a pathological need to maintain a facade of success. In 2019, after 26 years behind bars, the 65-year-old Jean-Claude Roman was released. On parole, that news deeply shocked France. Overall, not in the best way. And in the town of Imprisonment, where the tragedy happened, people were outraged. Mr. Morris, a regular customer at the bakery just a few steps from the espresso kiosk where Roman went to buy newspapers after committing the murder that tragic day, said, But surprisingly, there were other opinions as well. One of the neighbors, whose wife knew Florence Roman personally, said, After his release, Jean-Claude began living in the Benedictine monastery in Périgueux. His release conditions were very strict. Mandatory visits to a psychiatrist, an electronic bracelet that shows the man's location, a ban on any contact with the victims' families, a ban on appearing in the media, and payment of compensation to the victims. But already in 2022, the man was released from these obligations as well. He now lives in a village in the Indre department and receives a pension of about 800 euros. He lives quietly, inconspicuously. Maybe his neighbors don't even suspect who he is. Or maybe they do.
That's how it is, dear ones. That's today's story. In my view, it's totally crazy. Still, it's an interesting kind of craziness, no matter how strange that sounds. Thanks for watching. Thanks for spending time with me, enjoying the fire, and listening to this interesting, if slightly creepy story. And I hope everything goes well for you.